Well, good afternoon. It's great to be with you. I'm the director of the Depression Center at the University of Louisville, so most of my time is spent trying to understand and help people with mood disorders, and also to do research and to teach. And I'm going to try to share some of the things that I've learned along the way with you in just a brief talk this afternoon. First, I thought I'd start with a little bit of a light thing for a very serious topic. And I particularly like this cartoon because isn't that guy lonely? He's isolated, and he's sitting there at the table by himself, and he's offered an antidepressant. Now, are antidepressants the answer to loneliness and disconnectedness? Well, we'll take a brief look at that later on in my brief talk, but it's not the full answer, to be sure. So loneliness is increasing, and I think we're going to hear a lot more about that this afternoon. So I'll just note that it's more than doubled, apparently, in the last 3 or 4 decades. And we'll try to examine why that might be happening. But one of the reasons, I think, is that there's a lot of depression out there. I bet that all of you in the audience know of somebody or come across somebody that's had a mood disorder of one sort or the other. So these are data from a very large study done by the National Institute of Mental Health that found that the lifetime risk for having some major mood disorder is about 1 out of 5 people in the United States. And so there's a lot of depression out there. There's probably going to be a fair amount of loneliness that goes with that. And we're going to explore that just a bit here this afternoon. But I wanted to turn back in time a bit to say depression's been with us since the beginning of time. And here's a famous Kentuckian who suffered from depression. Did you know that Lincoln suffered from melancholia? This particular quote really caught my attention. Here he says, "I'm now the most miserable man living. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell." Can you capture the hopelessness? Can you sense that he might have been disconnected, maybe isolated himself at that time? And he says, "I awfully forebode I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better." Lincoln, suicidal? Well, the most extreme form of disconnect that I see in my practice is when someone becomes suicidal. And here's some data on suicidality in the United States. It's really alarming. Of most of the major disorders that kill people in the United States, like heart disease and cancer, the rates are going down. But what's happening with suicide? It's going up. Very disturbing. It's the second leading cause of death in people under 35, and it's jumped up about 1/3 in the last couple decades. And we do know that depression is one of the major causes of suicide, or it's linked very closely to suicide. Now, I'm going to try to explain this slide. It's a little busy, but I try to weave a little science into this because this meeting is about the connection between spirituality and science. So I think I can perhaps explain this slide by turning around. This was a study, a large study done deriving data from the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project. Over 3,000 people responded to this survey. And they were judged on whether they had very good or excellent mental health. And then they were examined for 2 constructs. One is social disconnectedness. In this, it was actually how many social contacts you had, where you were involved in the community or not. But then another concept was perceived isolation. And this is where you sense that you're isolated from others. So you could actually you could be attending a church, or you could be having coworkers at work. There are people in your life, but yet you feel alienated and isolated from them. We see that a lot in depression. Well, it turns out with this particular study that people that had the lowest estimate of their social disconnectedness or perceived isolation had the best mental health. Can you see here? 85% chance of having good or excellent, very good or excellent mental health if you had a low estimate of perceived isolation. But let's go down here to the bottom of perceived isolation. If you had a sense of high perceived isolation, you were at about 25% chance of very good or excellent mental health. So there is a definite link between a sense of disconnectedness, particularly if it's perceived, that's the way you see yourself as you relate to the world. So it could be very dangerous. The next slide shows the relationship between loneliness, perceived social support, and what happens with mental health treatment. So in this particular study, there were 23 research studies, and it turned out that the greater loneliness or perceived social support at the beginning of treatment, the worse outcomes. So if I had somebody that came into my office that was pretty connected and didn't feel very lonely, I'd expect they would have a better outcome than somebody that felt disconnected. So I'm really trying whatever I can do to try to help people reconnect. So how do you treat this? Can you treat loneliness? What do you think? Can you treat it with medical treatments? Well, we're going to find out here. There's been some work done on this. But first I thought I'd show you another light moment. And I really like Charles Schultz's observations sometimes. Now, psychiatric help here is pretty cheap. It's managed care gone to its extreme. It's only 5 cents. But Charlie walks up and says, "Can you cure loneliness?" And Lucy says, "For a nickel, I can cure anything." And he says, "Can you cure deep down, black bottom of the well, no hope, end of the world? What's the use, loneliness? For the same nickel?" Well, I guess it tells us that loneliness is pretty hard to treat, as we're going to see next. So there have been studies of specific medical treatments or interventions for loneliness, and it turns out that there's a form of therapy called cognitive behavior therapy. Have any of you ever heard of that therapy? Some hands up. It's a well-known therapy. There are over 400 randomized controlled trials. That's a research study that shows that this is an effective treatment, but it also has been studied specifically for loneliness and been found to be very effective. But some other approaches really haven't, surprisingly. For example, ones that try to improve social support, ones that increase social contact, skills training. Now, there haven't been studies specifically of using a medication for loneliness, but I'm going to show you some data that suggests that if you're trying to treat depression, a medication might treat the depression and might therefore be helpful for someone that's very lonely. So when I see someone that comes in and has both those conditions, I have a sense that a medication might be a useful part of their treatment. So here is a slide that summarizes a lot of work that's been done over many years with what we call CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, antidepressant medication, and treatment of depression. And I'll just point out a couple things. One is that the yellow bar is combined treatment. So if someone comes into me that has pretty severe depression, they're pretty lonely and disconnected, my sense is that if I treat them with a comprehensive approach of both some psychotherapy and some medication, that their overall results are going to be better, and research has borne that out. But it also turns out that you can treat depression with medication alone. This is the green bar. The cognitive therapy alone is the red bar. So if you had depression, you wouldn't necessarily need an antidepressant medication to pull out of it. So here are some things that work for depression. Will we ever use electroshock therapy for loneliness? Well, not just for loneliness, but if you had really profound, deep, suicidal depression that wasn't responding to anything else, it can be a godsend. And I have patients just in the last few months that have not done well with medications and other things, and you've treated them with this treatment that sounds pretty old-fashioned. You might have seen movies on it that weren't very flattering, but the newer forms of treatment actually are working. And there's some new exciting breakthroughs. One of them is called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Has anyone heard of that one? It's where you use a magnet that's about the same power as an MRI, and you apply it to a part of the brain that's right up here. It's in the frontal cortex, and you have to give about 30 treatments, but it works for treatment-resistant depression, we call it, where you've tried other things and it hasn't worked yet. It's a very encouraging, hopeful development. Things like light therapy, can they work? Yes. A diet, does that make a difference? Yes. The Mediterranean diet turns out to be very helpful for depression. So when someone comes to me for treatment, I'm looking under any stone, if you will, for things that might be helpful to them, a comprehensive, holistic approach. Now, I didn't put spiritual approaches up here, but yet I think they are important. And in my book that I've written for the general public, it's a self-help book, I do include a whole chapter on spirituality and recovery from depression. So I wanted to just touch very lightly on some research that I've done. We've been working on using computers to help people with depression. And you might think, gee, maybe one of the reasons for loneliness is we're living in a technological society and we have social media and people are on their computers and they're playing computer games and they're not connecting with people. And I sure see folks like that. I see young folks that come in that are in their 20s and they're in their parents' basement and all they do all day long is get on the computer and play games. And they're not out there connecting with people. And that's really worrisome, isn't it? And so there are ways in which technology can, I think, worsen loneliness or even encourage loneliness and the breakdown of some of the connections we want to make in society. But yet there are some ways in which technology may help us make connections. So we've been at work at the University of Louisville for over 20 years on developing forms of treatment that use computers to augment what the human does. It's not trying to replace the human, but it's trying to help people who might have depression be able to do some of the work on their own online and then come into the doctor less frequently at more convenience, or even to do some of their support by telephone calls or other ways so they don't have to come in and get babysitters or miss work and so forth to come into their appointments. So this is a program that we developed here called Good Days Ahead, and it turns out that now several major research studies have shown that it's quite helpful in the treatment of depression. Here's one that we did that's been published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and we assigned people to a wait list, meaning they were getting no treatment at all, to cognitive therapy. It's the same thing as cognitive behavior therapy. That's the black line, CT, or to computer-assisted therapy, treated them for 8 weeks, and they were on no drugs, by the way. And as you can see, they did really well with reduction of their depression scores. And then when we checked them after 3 and 6 months, they were not showing return of symptoms. So this was very encouraging to us. And so then we were able to get funding for the National Institute of Mental Health and did a follow-up to this, which was much larger. We did it along with the University of Pennsylvania. And lo and behold, we replicated these data and showed that you could compare a computer-assisted form of treatment that cut the contact with the therapist by about 2/3 and get the same results. So that's what we're trying to do with some of this work. I think it shows that technology isn't always our enemy. Sometimes it can help us reach more people. There are lots of people out there with depression. We don't have enough resources to treat all of them. And this is one way we might be able to do that. So how do we reconnect? The research that I showed you wasn't really encouraging unless you went to a certain kind of therapy for treating loneliness. But that's a treatment study. But if you think about things that can be done, here are some suggestions that I found and sort of elaborated on from a nice article in Psychology Today, which appeared in 2018. So some of the recommendations would be that we would really put connection as a priority in our lives. We should treat it like exercise or something else that's really important and spend time on this, get game plans to do it, and really make the effort. Join a faith community, of course, or increase your involvement in a faith community. Choose activities. In fact, I just had a session this morning with someone that was feeling very lonely and isolated, and she was crying. And we were talking about what she was doing. And she was going to the gym, and she was working out. But I don't know if any of you go to gyms, but usually people go to gyms and they work out. They don't really connect. I've been going to the Y for over 25 years, and I don't think I've ever had a relationship with somebody that's followed up on that. My relationships are other places, like in my church choir and things like that. So it's a different kind of way of making a connection. Schedule time, face-to-face with people. If your connections are far away, like my children all live far away, so we actually schedule Skype time, which is very helpful. Be a good neighbor. And then lastly, look for linking and sharing opportunities. And I'm not sure if much of this is going on in Louisville, but there are these kinds of programs going on in other communities. Perhaps I've not been in touch with some of the things that are going on in Louisville. Here are several of them. One's called Link Ages. I was particularly interested in this one because elders have a big problem with social isolation and loneliness. And this was a way of connecting youth with elders and sharing activities, like the elders would cook a meal or something for a student that needed to be fed, and then the student would help out with gardening chores or get them to the grocery store or something like that. And it seemed to me that that was a really practical, really wise way to connect. And again, technology is used here to make these connections. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up, and I'm just about out of time, and we're going to go on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, before we go on to the next speaker, I wanted to invite any of the panelists to respond to what Dr. Wright was just discussing.
Well, one thing that struck me about the loneliness and isolation, they tend to go together, right? Is I was thinking about tribal peoples all over the world. Like the very worst thing that could ever happen to you was to be banished from the community. In fact, to be banished from a community, you just pretty much assumed that that person was not going to live much longer after that. And so I'm just thinking about the impact of this isolation crisis that we're feeling. I mean, it's something that's been hardwired into us to be a part of community, and so that isolation space is quite dire for us as a mammal. You know, and my guides have said to me, you know, look, I'm sorry, but you're a mammal, and mammals have to be with other mammals, and mammals actually need to sync their electromagnetic fields with another mammal. I mean, sometimes I have to have it broken down like that technically to get me to break out of my isolation sometimes. But anyway, that just came up for me as I was thinking about this crisis of isolation and how important that connection is. I mean, we can't get around it. And so many of our structures, I mean, even our single home family situations, which are environmentally pretty catastrophic because basically we're having to recreate an entire ecosystem for each household, which is not very efficient. But not only that, it does create these isolation situations, I think, that we're now experiencing this epidemic of depression and suicide.
So I think you covered most parts of the things, but I think an important thing that is the stigma attached to mental health, and especially in our communities where it's actually hidden and we never discover students, for example, or youth who might be suffering from this kind of thing. So I think, having that open discussion and also actually accepting, because you cannot close your eyes and expect that the problem will go away. I think the realization is really the first step to curing any of the mental illnesses. I remember when I came to Canada first time in 1988, and this is when the Winter Olympics were held, and I gave a talk at the Children's Hospital, and it was cold, minus 40 degrees, and as I was driving over one of the river bridges, the river was frozen, I saw this lady trying to get up onto the bridge, and that really, my heart stopped, and I slammed my brake right on the bridge. I almost got killed. People were honking horns and they were driving by. And I approached that lady and I said to her, "Excuse me, can I help you?" And as she turned, I saw a little baby in her lap. And I quickly grabbed her and I brought her into the hospital and I handed her to our staff to look after. 30 years went by. One day I heard a knock on my door, and there was this lady with a young girl of, quite some, almost grown up. And she said to me that you perhaps don't really recognize us, but think about October of 1988. You are the one who actually made that stop. My daughter has just graduated from medical school. So I think it's a moment for us to really reflect back. They are part of our society. They are part of us. I think it's something that we all need to care to make sure that they become taxpayers and not the tax burden as the society perceives them often. The other thing I would like to really add to is that people who are caregivers and take care of these people and patients who are suffering from mental illness, they also need our support and help. So I think it needs the entire society, as we say that it takes the entire village to raise a child. And I think we need to take this on as our own problem, not just the problem of those people whose family members are suffering from this debilitating illness, which we manage. Unfortunately, we have not found a cure for it.
Thank you. Very good.
Dr. Wright, there's a point that I hope to come back to after Dr. Saeed speaks. I suspect we may touch on it as well regarding the computer-assisted cognitive therapy treatments and what that might mean for access. You mentioned it briefly, but how does that figure
that's really been the goal of our work, is to improve access, because it turns out that if you're diagnosed with depression, a year later, less than half of those people have gotten any treatment at all.
Wow.
Not even like being given an antidepressant from the primary care doctor, let alone having an effective psychotherapy.
Right.
So there's a huge problem out there. And you talked about stigma. And there are all these barriers to getting treatment. If you go to a primary care doctor, for example, and you say you're depressed, getting from there to a therapist hardly ever happens. There's all kinds of things that get in the way of it. And there's cost, too. And it costs a lot of money to go to therapy. Lots of places in the United States now, you can't even use your insurance because a therapist won't take it. So we're trying to figure out ways to reduce the cost and still deliver really effective treatment to people. Now, there's one thing I forgot to say about this computer-assisted therapy, which I think was very interesting, is we just finished a large study called a meta-analysis. That's where you look at all the studies that have been done all over the entire world, and we found 40 studies on computer-assisted therapy for depression. And overall, they worked, but it turned out that the kind of human support that was put together with the computer program made a difference. And I think this is telling. If you had email support, that is, you didn't really talk to a human, but you talked to them just by a computer on email, the effect was much less robust than if you had a telephone call, just a warmth of a human voice, or you had a face-to-face contact, but you were fewer of those. So that seemed to be the best. Yeah. So we're not at the point of saying, well, computer can deliver your treatment. Right. It's just going to help to deliver the treatment, and still we need this human connectedness, which is so essential.
Right. Dr. Said?
It's very true. I also really think that often in our society, children who are really gifted in a way, but they are labeled as autistic. And I think these are the children who change the world. These are the people who change the world. And unfortunately, we perceive them as not normal. You think about Albert Einstein to Steve Jobs, these are the people who change the world, and yet the society labeled them as not normal. So they were, in that sense, autistic. But I think what we need to be able to do is to reach out to them and see how we can actually enhance their certain skill sets using computer-assisted approaches to be able to really bring them back into the mainstream by enhancing their social and emotional intelligence. But they are the most beautiful children when you see them. I think this is the best thing that you could do, is to be in the company of these kids who are gifted, they're smart, they're intelligent, and they're really very focused on a particular task.
Good point.
Well, Dr. Jess Wright, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.